Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. We're not going far today. We've got some problems. This is a schmooze day, and my guests are not here for the most part. Although I do have one guest, so I will make good use of Paul Milet, who is in Ottawa. Paul is a retired colonel in the the Canadian military, and he is a big peace activist. He has an organization called Awakening the Peacemaker Within. Is that the title, Paul?
That's the title of the website. Yeah.
And he actually has programs to help people figure out how to stop being paralyzed and get on with the work of producing peace in the world. And we were expecting Professor Sam Lanfranco to join us, and I hope to goodness he shows up, but he hasn't yet. So we're late getting started. My assistant Adam Wynn is here too. Say hi, Adam.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're fine. All right. So what's worrying you these days, Paul?
Well, the big thing I think that's on everybody's mind is certainly the Ukraine war. That is one thing. And then the second thing is sort of the confluence between pandemics and environmental degradation and conflict. Probably the three, what I view as the existential threats to civilization that we have to face and deal with. So that's basically where I'm coming from. And the Ukraine war has taken some priority in the last two or 3 weeks.
Absolutely. Yeah. Adam, what's most on your mind?
I'm just here to listen right now. I do share some sentiments around the Ukraine situation, but I'll let you guys do most of the talking.
That's true, but when you do speak, please put your mouth toward the microphone because already I'm not hearing you. We have an ongoing dispute where Adam's audio is not up to snuff, and I've offered to buy him a new equipment, a new microphone or whatever it takes, but he's in denial. So we go on this little dispute about I can't hear you, and then he sort of brushes it off. Anyway, there we go.
Can you hear me now? Because I'm on a different microphone, that not on the computer microphone.
Okay, it's better. It's better. Thank you. Okay, so everybody's worried about Ukraine. And you know what's worrying me about Ukraine has to do with things like nuclear weapons. Because this new development, I think, is proving two completely opposite points. And I think it's bringing the issue to the foreground again, whether nuclear weapons are really a dangerous thing or a wonderful asset for a country to own. And I can see it both ways. And it's not just my head, it's that the incentives are double contradictory. And that is, you can say that, okay, for the first time in ages, somebody is actually threatening to use nuclear weapons. Putin has actually threatened to do it, and in effect. And if anything should put the fear of God in people, that would do it. If somebody's actually threatening to use these, because we've shrugged our shoulders for 30 years, or the last 15 anyway, and said, well, more than 15, quite a while, since the end of the Cold War, people have said, no big deal. Everybody's used to them by now, and nobody's used them lately, so they're not going to use them. Everybody realizes it would be crazy, so nobody would do that, and therefore we don't have to worry. Let's leave them alone. Don't bother. And so now we have reason to say, somebody might be crazy enough to actually use those damn things. In that case, they really are dangerous, and we really ought to do something about it. On the other hand, you have perfect proof that nuclear weapons are a wonderful deterrent, because, you can say, well, Putin's got them, and the U.S. now is afraid to go in and help Ukraine because they're afraid Putin would use nuclear weapons. So he's really deterring the U.S. by having these things and by looking like he means business with them, which he may. And more than that, we know now pretty clearly that if Ukraine had kept the nuclear weapons that it presumably owned, I think you can quibble about whether it really had control or owned them, but if they'd kept the nuclear weapons they had rather than give them back to the Soviets to Russia when they left the Soviet Union, or when the Soviet Union broke up, if they still had them, then Putin wouldn't be attacking them today because he'd be afraid of them. So it's pretty good evidence that nuclear weapons are a good deterrent. Now, which side do you come down on? The side that says, well, in fact, there's such a good deterrent, logically, that every country ought to have them. My goodness, if Ukraine should have kept its nuclear weapons, then maybe Poland should have nuclear weapons of its own. Or, maybe, the people who are the Uyghurs ought to have nuclear weapons to keep the Chinese from oppressing them. And they're just a province of China and stuff. Maybe everybody. So let's all countries get nuclear weapons and we'll deter each other. Nobody will attack any country because they'll all be scared the retaliation will be so great. Very powerful argument in favor of keeping nuclear weapons, but in fact, expanding them. But then if you take that logic and you say every country in the world ought to have nuclear weapons, then clearly the chances of accident or the chances of some psychotic ruler using them increase exponentially. They clearly get more and more dangerous. So the only conclusion is, if any country has nuclear weapons, then all countries equally should have them. And then we'll deter each other. But nobody should have them because they're too dangerous for anybody to have. Is that the logical answer?
Well, there's a couple of important points that you've made. One of them is that that's what distinguishes this current conflict in the Ukraine, the shadow of nuclear weapons. But I don't think the Ukraine ever owned nuclear weapons. I mean, we had nuclear weapons here in Canada, and it was under a joint custody arrangement, and with regards to the command and control and the maintenance and that sort of thing. In fact, I worked on them in a base in Canada in the 70s. And yes, the American presence was there, and very, very strict command and control was there. And when it came time for us to get rid of them, the Americans showed up with their Starlifter, and away they went. And that's probably the same thing in the Ukraine, that if they had retained their nuclear weapons, it's extremely doubtful that they would have been usable.
Okay, maybe they should have got, if you still pursue the logic, if they sent them back, maybe they should have gotten their own. Why didn't they immediately start building nuclear weapons? Because now if they'd done that, they'd be safe, right?
Well, you're absolutely right. One thing about this is that because nuclear weapons has given the Americans pause in this conflict, and they've decided on different strategies, what message does it send to everybody else? I mean, what message is being sent to Iran now? That if I can get nuclear weapons, or North Korea or somebody, then this is another way that a balance of power can now exist with regards to superpowers. I mean, the Afghan and the Iraq war clearly showed that superpowers can be defeated by insurgencies, and that's one way of doing it. And then you look at the deterrent effect. I mean, there are other deterrent effects. I mean, nuclear weapons now come in very, very small tactical sizes, which increases their usability. So it's not to say that Putin might, turn Ukraine into glass, but there are maybe high-value targets that he could send a very, very strong message to with very, very small weapons.
Okay. If they use one of these tactical nuclear weapons, how big is that in comparison to Hiroshima?
A fraction of the size. You may just want to blow up a bridge. I mean, you may want to put these things in artillery. The Russians showed off this hypersonic weapon the other day. They're not going to fire many of those. That's an extremely expensive weapon, but that is nuclear capable. And aircraft can be nuclear capable. You can drop a nuclear bomb kind of thing from a very small bomb. And these things, and that's one of the big risks of proliferation going on here, is that the Americans and a lot of these countries are investing in these small tactical weapons, which increase their usability. That's a huge risk that can come out of this. But the bigger risk is what the message it sends to everyone else.
The message is, if you are the ruler of a country and you have the slightest idea that anybody is ever going to be your enemy, then you better get some nuclear weapons.
Yeah, North Korea is a good case in point.
But we all know that what happens if you have every 193 countries with nuclear weapons, something's going to go wrong.
Oh, yes. And there have been accidents in the past, and there have been some very close calls in the past. And you're absolutely right. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And something will happen. There will be a nuclear yield somewhere. Somebody does something. Now, we consider Putin a rational actor or not. That's a calculus that has to be made. I certainly hope that he's intelligent enough to stay out of this place. But you look at the Ukraine war. I mean, you want to say one thing about the Ukraine war is amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics, and his logistics is a mess. It's an absolute mess. So how long can he sustain this high intensity, very, very expensive war? And, to me, it could be over in a month as this thing grinds to some sort of stalemate. I mean, there's already various assessments about 10,000 Russian soldiers killed. That's just 3 weeks.
The Ukrainians claim it's more like 15,000, and who's to say?
But even if the measure is Iraq and Afghanistan,
right?
They've lost more in 3 weeks than the Americans lost in 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the carnage apparently is unbelievable. Given the conscripts and the tactics they were using. I think he thought he was going to just drive in, and this was just going to be a Sunday drive. Mm-hmm. And he violated most of the laws of war. Good operational practice.
But from what we have heard, and from pretty good sources in Russia, that he actually was surrounded by people who themselves, most of them did not know that he was actually going to do it. They didn't believe him. They didn't believe it was going to happen. I know one guy personally who is a very high level person. You see him on TV a lot as a representative of good thinking in Russia, and he is a good guy. But he was saying no, he wouldn't do that up till the last minute. And he's ashamed and horrified now.
I didn't believe it either.
Yeah.
But if you look in the context of Europe, I mean, in the last century, I mean, there have been more bloody wars in Europe than there have been in, pretty well all of recorded history and anywhere else. And we see Europe as a relatively, civilized place. But part of the fault is ours. I mean, we look at how conflict emerges. There's a pre-conflict stage, which we obviously failed and missed. And then we're in a during conflict stage, and we're going to go into a post-conflict stage soon. So why aren't we doing the during conflict stage? I watched CBC the other day, and they had a military officer on there talking about this. And you know where the conversation went? It went towards the Defense Department is going to spend a lot more money and get more money on defense. They're going to feed the apparatus that will do nothing but propagate this war.
Of course.
No talk whatsoever about the capacities that you need for peace operations or peace building, which are huge. There's a huge desperate demand for, and Canada can be placed there. But Canada just walks in lockstep.
Absolutely.
With
There's
NATO
no question.
here, we're going to send them weapons. We're just going to keep feeding this war and the killing and everything else. what's going on here?
I think there's simply no question that out of this conflict so far, the peace activists have lost, are the big losers, because everybody thinks in terms of what we need to do to help Ukraine, and they think only in terms of how to help them win, and not even how to stop it at the present, but how to actually make it possible for them to win. And now people are talking about, well, there's a stalemate. Neither side can win because they don't quite have what it takes, but neither one will back down. So this will keep on for a long time unless something else changes.
Well, ultimately, the Ukrainians will win. I mean, there's one of the principles of war is that defenses to offense is something like 7-1. In other words, when you're dug in, you're protected in some sense. When you're an invading force, you have to be out in the open. So you need roughly 7 times, for every one dug in, you need 7 people, and the massive logistics train behind it. I mean, they had 150,000 people, but only a third of that is combat soldiers. The remaining is just logistics and people driving trucks and conscripts, and carnage in that area is criminal,
And the demoralization too, because I hear that a lot of them have, either they're going hungry. They go around asking people, the townspeople, the villagers, for food.
Well, that's right. The lines of supply are so long that they're very, very vulnerable. And with drones and whatever, small arms and roadside bombs and all these things that insurgents can do, this is going to be a tremendous headache. And the Americans lost in Afghanistan, and there's military reasons for that.
So many of the soldiers, the Russian soldiers, are demoralized. They didn't even know they were going to be sent into a war. And now they're there, and they don't want to be fighting it necessarily. But at any rate, what do? If you could say, look, guys, come out with a white flag, and we will send you to a camp and train you how to be electricians, and then you can migrate to Venezuela and or Argentina or someplace, and we promise to take good care of you. So please defect. Here's how you do it. Now, I mean,
you can even use language like provide safe havens for Russian soldiers to sit out the war. You don't have to use treason words or defector words or whatever. It just, we're going to be a conscientious objector to the war, and we got a place for it. But these are the sorts of things that I believe Canada should be doing. Safe havens, humanitarian aid. I mean, those are the 2 big ones right now. Carve out some of these areas and sort of tell everybody that this is what they are, and that is worth defending. I mean, rather than getting into the killing game.
Yeah, right.
But we're going to learn big lessons out of this. Well, for a while, and one of the biggest ones, and ones that we're trying to advocate, at the UN level, is there are already existing UN resolutions that provide solutions to all of this. It's simply the will, a consensus of the willing to take advantage of it.
Tell me some.
The biggest one that we're working on is UN Resolution 53243, which is a program of action for cultures of peace. And what this tries to do is that they say, in one level, there is the idea that there are the laws of armed conflict, but there are insufficient precursors to that law that will allow you to use it. In other words, what peace operations must be strictly adhered to before you have any justification to make any invasion under the laws of armed conflict, other than war crimes. And so what you do is you take the laws of armed conflict and you flip them on their head. I mean, laws of armed conflict start with a presumption of just cause, and they laid them out. I mean, the Americans, before going into Iraq, said they had weapons of mass destruction, and Putin said we have a genocide going on or provocation or whatever. And then it rattles down to, a last resort, should be a last resort. There are certain weapons you can and you can't do. And right at the very bottom, it says minimize collateral damage, non-combatants and civilians. Whereas if you had laws of peace operations, just peace operations, that start with the premise, stop the violence, care for the victim, and then do the negotiation and ceasefires and whatever it is, the agreements you have to do, and then the reconstruction. And at the very end, you get to reconciliation and justice. Rather than starting with a unilateral statement in that regard, let's look after the humanitarian aspects here, just so that the killing would stop. And then that gives you all sorts of things that you can do in that regard, during conflict, pre-conflict, and post-conflict, that you can do. As let's assume that's below the line, whereas above the line you're doing deployment, combat operations, and then ceasefire monitoring, and in the warfighting part. So it's the peace part. So there has to be a global mindset that has to change here. That we don't always use military intervention as a primary means of settling disputes. And the problem is that you give a military guy a tank, and all of his problems are tank targets. And that's the same problem with countries. You give them massive militaries, and all their foreign affairs reflexes are power, power domination kind of thing. And
okay.
So we will, we're moving forward on that. The resolution is in place, and it's simply a matter of taking advantage of the high-level forums that are every year to implement them and get peace architectures going, get strong institutions for peace that are going to do foresight and prevention and peace building, and then peacemaking, and then peacekeeping, in the three stages of conflict. So.
Well, right now there's a huge enthusiasm and pep involved in supporting the Ukrainians, and certainly there's no question which side is more just and defensible and moral. They have every advantage in that regard. But the assumption is that the only thing they could have done was to fight back, and that therefore everybody should be supporting them by giving them many weapons as possible, since they can't possibly stop now. You couldn't stop, or you couldn't have refused to fight. I think they could have refused to fight, and I think that even now they could say, let's put a stop to this on whatever terms Putin demands. But you have to realize, okay, guys, come on in. You're going to come in and try to occupy our country? Come right in. But you're going to find it harder than you think, because we will not cooperate with you. And what happened in Prague during the Prague Spring back in, was it 68, something like that, would be a pretty good example of what is possible. They had Dubček basically had to say, do not resist, my friends in Prague or in Czechoslovakia. These guys, there'll be a bloodbath. Just let them in, but don't cooperate. For many, many months, they were very successful in impeding anything that the Russians attempted to do as occupiers. And I think that the same thing could be done now. And during World War II, the same thing happened in Denmark, for example. There was an interesting comparison. The Norwegians and the Danes were given about the same time the Nazis told them, we're coming in. And the Norwegians decided to fight. And of course, they lost, against the Nazis. But the Danes said, all right, I think they fought a week or so. And then they said, okay, come on in. But what the Russians were not able to maintain any of the orders that they imposed. And the Danes would, not the Russians, the Nazis. The Nazis were occupying force, and they wanted to have the Danes make ships, warships for them, because they were used to, the Danes were excellent shipbuilders. So they had, but the Danes said, well, we won't work unless there's a Nazi soldier watching us every minute. So the Nazi would stand there behind them and make them work, and they would work slowly, very slowly. And then the minute the Nazi turned his back, they'd unscrew the very bolts and nuts that they'd put on the minute before. They never, ever completed a single warship in Denmark during that time. And not only that, but there were many, many other ways. They'd have an assembly line, and the workers would say, well, we have to stop it at noon, because we have to go home and water our gardens, because our families would starve without our vegetable garden. So everybody knocks off at noon every day and goes home, and of course there's no productivity. And they even they found out when the Nazis were going to round up the Jews in Denmark and ship them off to death camps, and the day before they sent the word out, and they rescued almost every Jew in Denmark and put them on fishing boats and sent them over to Sweden, where Sweden was a neutral country, so these people survived. They saved almost all the Jews in Denmark that way. So these people, using nonviolent methods of resistance, made it impossible for the occupiers to accomplish any of the things that they set out to do. This is the kind of thing that if you have the preparation in advance and you work it out how you're going to do things, then you have an opportunity to really resist and make it impossible for any occupying force to accomplish whatever they think they want to do.
Well, you're absolutely right, Meta. I mean, the Gandhian philosophy of nonviolent resistance is something very, very, very serious. You're right. I mean, Ukraine is 44 million people, and if you think you're going to occupy that country, you're going to need 1 million soldiers, probably, some number like that, and then the headaches are going to start. And the idea of some kind of passive acquiescence, to the Russian soldiers or whatever, has merit when you consider the alternative of these cities being bombed and the carnage with regards to the deaths. But you look at how excited everyone's getting about this, and other things around the world which we don't. Look at Yemen, for example, or Myanmar or South Sudan, where orders of magnitude of people being killed are far, far greater. And yet this seems to get a proportionate amount of attention. And that to me is a bit of a puzzle. I mean, we are not equal in our decisions as to who we would like to protect and save. But one thing I've noticed about this conflict is that there's a new kind of strategy emerging with regards to alternatives to the threat of nuclear weapons, and that is economic warfare. Mm-hmm. I mean, it would appear that NATO and the United States are well along the path to crushing the Russian economy and crushing the ruble, the currency.
By the way, that's another reason why I think if I were Zelensky and I heard the ultimatum from Putin yesterday or the day before saying, surrender and we'll stop flattening Mariupol, I would have accepted. Because I would say, come on in and you will not succeed. Not only that, but the rest of the world is already imposing huge economic sanctions on you. And and they're going to keep it up. So, we may have to accept something temporarily, but we're going to win in the long term. And he would be way ahead of having Mariupol continue to be totally destroyed. I think 80% of it has already been flattened. So
that's right. And what it says, if you give up Mariupol, is that he can move across southern Ukraine. He could probably start making a bridge into Moldova, where there's a large Russian population, Russian speaking. So there is that whole factor, but you're absolutely right. I mean, killing women and children and this sort of thing, there has to be alternatives. And at some point, you have to say no. And any sort of just peace theory, that says just stop the violence. This is the number one thing. And then everything you've said, Meta, kicks in. And I think Putin knows that he can't control this country. I mean, even from a military sense, the supply of weapons that can go to the Ukrainian army is endless. I mean, there's a pipeline in there that is just full to the brim. And I think as the Russians burn down their weapons, there's numbers of 300 tanks destroyed, or large numbers. I mean, modern armies can't sustain that kind of attrition. And these little javelin missiles and stingers and whatever, I mean, that's what defeated the Russians in Afghanistan. The Stinger missiles and things. And here they go again. Didn't anybody learn anything? Haven't they learned from Iraq? Haven't they learned from Vietnam? The superpowers are vulnerable.
Well, you started speaking about economic sanctions, and I'm very interested in that. And I wonder what you think in terms of a war by economic sanctions. If everybody tries to starve other people, what are even the ethics involved in it? I mean, that's an extreme example of what we see in the use of famine as a weapon of war. You put a siege. Mariupol, for example, has already been cut off from even water, certainly food and water and sanitation and anything for weeks. But the Yemenis have already been subjected to famine and as well as military attacks. Adam, every time you run your little wheel on your mouse, we hear it and it turns your face on. So either speak or do you have anything to say?
I did have a question about chemical weapons, but I will mute it. I didn't realize that it was picking up. I guess where the microphone is placed, it must be picking up the mouse.
Yeah.
I was reading about the chemical weapons in Ukraine in another window, and I was hoping to ask about that, but please continue this dialogue first. I'll mute it.
Okay, go ahead. Maybe Paul knows something about chemical weapons. I don't know what's going on there. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is huge activity going on with regards to NBCW, nuclear, biological, chemical warfare, in the United Nations to prohibit these sorts of things. And certainly the reduction of chemical weapons in the United States and various countries is ongoing. Like the landmines, banning landmines and banning chemical weapons. And unfortunately, there has been some instances in either Iraq or Syria where these weapons have been used. And to me, or at least as a military person, there is not a lot of military utility in chemical weapons. I mean, it's just as dangerous to you as to whoever you're targeting, even in biological weapons. So, I mean, one has to be very, very desperate to use these things. And then one has to have a target that's pretty isolated out there somewheres. And I know they've used them against villages, but it's clearly, a war crime. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that. And I don't know if the laws of war are giving Mr. Putin any pause at all. But the way that he's ratcheting up his military operations is that, he's back in World War II. I mean, this is what you did in World War II. You have massive artillery barrages, and then you moved in troops behind it, either tanks or whatever, and you scorched earth kind of thing, with battles of Stalingrad and whatever. But, I think the technology is going to catch up to them in that sense. I mean, Turkish drones are now being used in Ukraine, the theater there, and even very, very small drones. He's going to be very vulnerable to that. But my whole view is, it's the loss of life that's going to happen between now and then, when he decides that this is unsustainable. Or if this economic warfare gets to a point where people say, this guy's got to go. And the oligarchs or the billionaires or whatever say, This is not very helpful. You know, the moment somebody has to take a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread, Mr. Putin's going to get a message here. You know, this
Yes,
is not
but I'm not
hyperinflation.
sure that it's how long it's really sustainable. I mean, everybody loses if you have an economic, for example, a boycott or blockade or something of that kind. Everybody loses, and the question is, how long can can one side hold out, imposing sanctions on the other? One of the things, of course, that until recently, I think Putin was counting on was that probably Germany would not do anything very drastic because they depended so much on Russian gas. And but then they said, well, we will not allow the completion or anybody to turn on the gas to go through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So this really does apparently hurt Russia, but it also, of course, puts some real strain on the Germans and, well, some other European countries, but mostly Germany. And
global inflation, yeah.
Yes, and also, but then I heard, and this I don't know whether he ever made it explicit or not, but the natural response would be for Putin to say, well, if you won't turn on Nord Stream 2, then I'm going to shut off Nord Stream 1. Wow. Now, that would really hurt him, but it would really be a very big blow to Germany, because they really are counting on the every day using the gas coming through there. Okay, so there was an interesting conversation or an interview, which I didn't hear, but I saw the transcript of it on CBC a couple of days ago with Bill McKibben. And Bill McKibben said, you know, we should take seriously the notion that we're going to have to quickly be able to supply Germany with, and maybe other countries, but certainly Europeans in general, with enough gas, especially next winter, because the Russian gas is very iffy, and they've put themselves into a vulnerable situation by becoming dependent on it. So he said, let's start making alternative things. These ships that are carrying Javelin and Stinger missiles and things to Europe now could be instead carrying heat pumps and insulation and things of this kind. And we should make an all-out war effort to, within the next 6 months, provide the kinds of materials to the people in Europe so that they can withstand the actual deprivation of all Russian gas and oil. And he said it can be done. We could be quickly, you know, in a war, that's what you do. You convert to producing the kinds of materials that you want. And we could make millions of heat pumps and send it to Europe so they could quickly not only get off of oil and gas, but make a big move in the direction of freedom from fossil fuel uses and solving the greenhouse gas issue. If we do it right, we can provide the kinds of materials that will solve both problems at one time. I thought that was brilliant.
Well, that's right. Go green is going to help everybody in every sort of direction. But even at the end of the day, you know, at the end of all of this, how are we going to respond? I mean, you look at the historical alternatives that we have here. I mean, after World War I, we virtually crushed Germany. And what did that do? We've been moving factories wholesale out of Germany. And that just sowed the seeds for World War II. After World War II, we learned that lesson, and we made Germany and Japan democracies and global economies. So here we are at another inflection, point in history here. What are we going to do when this is over? Probably the inflection point that we missed was in 1990 when the Warsaw Pact collapsed. You know, why did we go the expansion route of NATO and not the rebuilding Russia, in a sense, welcoming them into either the European Union or whatever? And, you know, the most honest thing to do is the Warsaw Pact collapsed, then NATO should have dissolved itself and restructured that alignment. So we missed that point. And we sowed the seeds for what's happening right now. The fact that big powers now act with relative impunity. Power politics have now happened from Vietnam to you name it. And so we're going to have to look at what we're going to do afterwards, and hopefully we can learn the lessons from World War II and get a just peace out of this in a sense. And that's probably a big question that merits very, very serious attention, as this thing winds down, and it will end. I mean,
what the problem that's complicating that is, it all depends on whether, I think the Germans and the Japanese were ready to acknowledge that they had some flaws and that they made some bad judgment along the way. I don't think at the moment public opinion in Russia is at the stage of saying, yeah, a few people will say, yeah, I'm ashamed because somehow I should have done more to keep Putin from gaining so much power. But most people are not going to say that. Most people are still absolutely brainwashed, and maybe that's the wrong word to use for it, but I think it really, come on in, Sam. Here's Sam and Franco. Hello, Sam.
Your message is well taken. After Japan and Germany, Hitler and the leadership of Japan was, they went away, and we rebuilt the countries. So we're going to make some assumption that the longevity of Mr. Putin is getting shakier and shakier. And if he does no longer, find himself in power anymore, we have to rebuild the democracy there. And it was there for a very brief period of time after Gorbachev. And then it was hijacked.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sam just comes and goes. Okay, hi, Sam.
I had a tragedy this morning. A project I work with in Nigeria, a driver got murdered. And I spent the morning on my tractor thinking about that, and I had set up for this and just forgot about this.
Okay.
So we have to maybe cancel the project. We don't know.
Oh God, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I do some work there too.
Was it a political murder?
No, economic opportunity. There was a gang on the road, I think, tried to rob a load of rice and shot the driver.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, we're close to winding up, but we've been talking about the problem of, why don't you finish your thoughts and see where Sam may be able to hook on to where your argument has been going and comment on that.
Well, one of the things where the argument went was the idea of economic warfare and sanctions. What this is going to do to crush their economy or the ruble, and then what obligations are we going to have in post conflict to rebuild all of this. So maybe as an economist, you have some insights there.
Mm-hmm.
No, well, the fear is that it's going to breed autarky, that countries are going to say, we're not going to trade with you for political reasons. We're going to try and build our own capacity for economic reasons. Some of that is good. Some of it is a reaction against some of the worst parts of globalization. But some of it may be, we just don't know what's going to happen there. We have no idea. And if you combine that with what's going to happen from climate change, it's a very messy stew at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, countries are going to, the rich countries are going to try to become more autonomous, and nobody has any idea how this current invasion is going to end. The end story on this is completely up in the air. It's quite tragic.
I had a thought that I was in the middle of when you came in, and that is that the generosity and magnanimity of say the victorious powers, and let's assume that Ukraine and all of the Western European countries, the rest of the world in general, because everybody supports Ukraine unless they happen to be nuts. When there is victory in the sense of Russians being clearly defeated. The question is how generous and magnanimous can we be in terms of not being hard on them, but rather trying to assist and in making a transition from that authoritarian government into something reasonable and civil. And I think that the problem is that the general public opinion in Russia has been influenced very much by the Putin's control of the media. The press and the television and so on simply have not been able to present the full picture. And so the public opinion is not overwhelmingly, but pretty damn solidly behind Putin now there. And unless they recognize that they made a big mistake, I don't think it's going to be easy for other countries to be very particularly generous and forgiving. And there's a lot to forgive. So this is kind of relevant to your concerns, Sam, since you are, I never had a chance to introduce you at the beginning of the hour, but you're very engaged with the governance of the internet, and you travel around on, is it ICANN that you're part of? This?
Well, I'm part of ICANN, but let me just jump in there because a lot of interesting things are going on right now. A number of people have said, just cut off Russia from the internet, not really knowing what that means. But a group of quite wise colleagues of mine, including Steve Cooper, that was one of the 5 that created the Internet Protocol, they went through all the options that could be pursued. And basically, the short answer to how to deal with something like Russia at the moment in terms of the internet is just to blacklist sites that are bad. Anything else in terms of closing off access to the servers that route stuff and so forth would do just as much damage to civil society and the dissidents in Russia. That's my first point. The second point is I think the Russians know a lot more than we think they know. With that big rally that he held the other day, they were basically told, you're at work, you leave work, you go to that rally. There may be, 10, 20% of the population who are as nuts as people are here. But they get a lot more information through virtual private networks and other things. So I don't think things are good there. One of my reflections is that if this were an African event within Africa, they have standard techniques. The one is that the oligarchs or the military, the senior people around the dictator simply say, okay, you have to go. We're going to send you to a country that has no extradition treaty. You can take your money, you can take your cars, you can take your family, you can take your girlfriends, go. That's scheme 1. Scheme 2 is in this kind of thing. What happens is that, and in Russia, the senior military are all oligarchs. They have major stakes in the economy at a very high level. What tends to happen in other countries is that the junior military, one step down, those who are not benefiting from being in the inner circle with the oligarchs, they stage a coup. Well, neither of those looks likely in Russia. Maybe some of the oligarchs will do something we don't know, but it's unlikely the military will do anything but they might, because they have very strong interests in the economy. When I was there in the 90s, one general basically controlled the shipment of coal for the whole country, one general. And if you go down the list of industries, they're always there. So I don't think anybody has a good idea of how this is going to end. The Ukrainians will probably give the Russians a little something as face saving. We won't be happy with that. Nobody will be happy with that. But it's pretty hard to figure out, once you back someone like Putin into a corner, unless somebody makes him disappear, it's very hard to know how this is going to end. I just pray with everybody else that he doesn't keep escalating as he did in Syria. Basically, he had no reservations about what level of violence he'd go to. But
Okay, you've mentioned,
Sure.
at least touched
Yeah.
on a major question for me, and maybe you can elaborate because, we've just been warned by that the U.S. thinks that Russia is now getting ready to use some sort of cyber attack on American business, some companies or something like that. It's pretty obscure, but they've been right before that their intelligence was correct that Putin really was going to go ahead and attack. So I take it seriously that they probably know that Russia is going to do some sort of cyber attack. It seems to me there are two different dimensions to this cyber threat. One is, of course, that they do things like knock out a grid or take down some big company that supplies almost everything that we need, and that kind of real attack, taking down banks, for example, really messing up people's bank accounts would do it. But so that kind of thing is clearly the work that your organization, the governance of the internet, has to think about. But do you also worry about the misuse of the internet for misinformation, for deliberate lying and attempts to introduce confusion and acrimony within a society? They say the U.S. was subjected to that, where the Russians would try to exacerbate real tensions between ethnic groups in the U.S. or something of that kind. So this thing of disinformation seems to be a different dimension, but it worries me just as much as the problem of hacking and destructive cyber attacks.
Well, so let's separate the two for the minute. The cyber attacks are, if they come, they will come incrementally. The U.S. has massive capacity to disrupt the entire economy of Russia. Most of the cyber attacks thus far have all come out of the Ukraine. That's tactical. Let the Ukraine attack Russia cyber level. But at the cyber level, most of the big countries now have phenomenal capacity to go in and target just about whatever they want. And it would be a kind of a tit for tat kind of attacking as opposed to a broad scale attack.
Excuse me a second. Are you saying that a company would retaliate if say
the countries would retaliate? In Russia, basically, there are these cyber criminals who run these operations, and they're like mercenaries. So the government has capacity. The government's used mercenaries. The government used third countries. There's a lot of strategy behind how those cyber attacks would operate if they went high scale. The other one, in terms of the governance of the internet, I'm the president of a new organization called the Internet Integrity Task Force, and it's looking at notions of rights and responsibilities on the part of digital citizens nationally and globally. And we had some meetings lined up for the next few weeks in Washington and other places, and they've basically all been canceled, not because of the Ukraine, but because the issue of who governs what parts of the internet, whether it's false news, should Twitter decide whether or not the president of the United States has a Twitter account? Do we want that kind of governance and so forth? Independent of what good or bad people are doing. And so there are struggles beginning to take place now in the background. There are those who think the United Nations should be the governance agency. ICANN will not be the governance agency. That's pretty clear. It'll shrink to just deal with some technical issues about the security and stability of the domain name system. And that's my projection. And we'll see changes in leadership there probably fairly soon. The International Telecommunications Union has long been the sort of fox in the briar patch, trying to figure out how it could get major control of the governance of the internet. But that leaves open a very serious question. And I always phrase it like this. You meet people who have a complaint and they go, somebody should do something about that. They're not quite sure who the somebody is. They're not quite sure what the something is, and they don't really have a good notion of what the that is. Yeah. And there are institutes around that talk about digital citizenship, but some are very good. The best actually align themselves very closely with the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They sort of treat that as the North Star, the Southern Cross, to orient where you go. But most of them, including many of the university ones, if you look at their digital citizenship stuff, it's basically trying to teach a student or a faculty member how to be responsible, in other words, don't spread false news, and how to be a safe traveler. It's like telling somebody who's going to Rome to watch out for the pickpockets. That when you're online, just be careful. And most of those don't even talk about how much of the information about you that's out there you have no control over. It's not your health records and your social insurance number. It's all that information that got picked up as you just wandered around on the internet and as you walked in and out of stores.
That's the thing that worries me the least. I don't care. Basically, almost anything about me, I'll let you know anyway. Just ask me. I'm happy to tell you. So my privacy issue is absolutely minimal compared to most people. And I still don't understand why that is so important to people compared to some of the other things. Like what really bugs me is that I, for example, try to publish these, to disseminate these talk shows on Facebook. Right. And paying, boosting it. They'll send it out to, 90,000 different computers in a given week for something like $30. But so it's worth it for me, but they won't let me do it because they say, well, you're talking about serious political issues and we have rules to say you're not allowed to talk about anything except your cat and what you ate for breakfast.
Yeah, and those are one of the questions of internet integrity is what are acceptable business models? We have all kinds of unacceptable business models in the literal world. What are, and the thing coming down the pipeline, which I think is going to help precipitate a lot more awareness, is the thing that people are calling the metaverse. The best way to think of the metaverse is it's like the 1800s as Western Europe began to colonize Africa. The only difference is they're colonizing spaces where there are no indigenous people there and there are no animals there. Everything is going to be an artifact. Who controls the artifacts? Who controls the governance of those spaces? I mean, we have Canadian colleges that already have made a deal to make a virtual college. It's not distance education, it's a virtual college. You go in and create yourself. And you've got an avatar there. And can you set up a shop in there or not? Well, if you're on somebody's plantation, can you set up a shop or not? So we're thinking that we're moving into a period where it's not so much the privacy of my information, but the fact that I'm in digital servitude. I got there for free, but I can never leave.
I want you to come back, Sam, and we got to talk about this further, but we're over time. Right. So I appreciate everybody's participation. And so I'll see you again. Have a good day. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry I was late.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode 426. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, please look around because we have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your own thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.